two U.S. Navy pilots were shot down Sunday over the Red Sea in an apparent friendly fire incident. That is according to the U.S. military. This marks the most serious incident to threaten troops in over a year of the U.S. targeting Yemen's Houthi rebels. Both pilots were recovered alive after ejecting from their aircraft, with one suffering minor injuries. Now, the U.S. military had conducted airstrikes targeting Yemen's Houthi rebels at the time, although the U.S. military's Central Command did not elaborate on what their mission was and did not immediately respond to questions from the Associated Press. Meanwhile, you are now taking a live look right here from southern Gaza. All of this comes following a rocket fired from Yemen, which hit an area of Tel Aviv, leaving 16 people injured by shattered glass. That is what the Israeli military shared on Saturday. This comes days after Israeli airstrikes hit Houthi rebels, who have been launching missiles in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. Another 14 people had minor injuries as they rushed to shelters when air raid sirens sounded before dawn. That is according to the military. Now, the Houthis, in a statement on Telegram, said they had aimed a hypersonic ballistic missile at a military target that they did not identify. Israel's military said it was investigating, adding that, quote, "We emphasize that aerial defense is not hermetic." The Houthis' media office later reported airstrikes on Yemen's Houthi-held capital, and U.S. forces conducted airstrikes against a missile storage facility and a command facility operated by the Houthis. To talk more on this, I do want to bring in Ruthie Bloom, who is the former advisor at the office of Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, as well as a senior contributing editor at Jewish News Syndicate and the co-host of Israel Undiplomatic on JNS TV. And Ruthie, we appreciate you joining us here on Live Now from Fox.
Thank you so much for having me, Stephanie.
Absolutely. So I did want to start with the very latest involving the Houthis. And it seems now, Ruthie, that Hamas and Hezbollah, because they've become so fragmented and decimated, truly, we are seeing these continued attacks from the Houthi rebels ramp up.
Absolutely. You see, I think what they're feeling right now is that they're Iran's last proxy, and they're still standing, so to speak. I mean, after all, Israel has done quite a bit of damage to their facilities as well. However, they're flexing their muscles to show that Iran is still in business. And you mentioned that they did this in solidarity with the Palestinians in Gaza. But actually, they don't need to have solidarity with the Palestinians. This entire war since October 7th has been basically a war between Iran and Israel, and Iran uses its proxies. But right now, Iran is severely weakened as well, not to mention the fact that the mullahs in Tehran are very nervous about the imminent arrival of President Donald Trump in the White House in a month.
And let's talk about that. When we take a look ahead to January 20th, how does President-elect Trump taking office impact what is happening right now in the Middle East?
Well, in the first place, the impact it has is psychological because he isn't president yet. And in fact, the trouble is that there is no president of the United States. As we saw in the Wall Street Journal, a long piece about what has been going on in the Biden administration in the White House. There is no acting president. So the world is basically treating Trump as though he's already the president, though he doesn't have the authority of the president. There is a psychological element to it. And there is great fear among enemies that though Trump says, no, I don't want any wars, I'm ending all these wars, all I want is peace. And he means that. What he does not mean is what I want is to capitulate to the West's enemies. That not. He said to Israel, you know, finish the job quickly. What he meant was obtain a victory quickly, not give up. So there's a huge difference in a perception of how things are going to go from now on in Washington as the leader of the free world, as it's supposed to be.
There is, you know, President Biden, of course, still in the White House. There is that lame duck period. And you mentioned the psychology of all of this. We've also been hearing more talks about a potential ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Now, we have seen this stall and fall apart time and time again. How close is the latest round of negotiations going?
Well, you know, for one thing, it's the first time since the beginning of the war and talks about hostage negotiations that Israeli officials have been way more quiet about it, and rightfully so, because it does great harm to negotiations when you have, especially these protesters screaming, bring them home, et cetera. Hamas gets the message that it's, you know, it has more leverage. And this time Israeli officials are really trying to keep a lid on what's going on. So the only information we have on it is from anonymous sources in Hamas, anonymous sources in this newspaper, that news outlet. And so you really can't trust it. What we're hearing different. We're hearing conflicting reports. But one thing we know is this: because Hamas has been decimated, and because the only leverage it has now is the hostages, it's trying very hard to be intransigent while also giving in on some of its demands. And there are certain demands, however, that Israel cannot give in on. So there is still tension in Israeli society over this, and also among the negotiators. But it does seem as though there's some more movement in this direction than there was, let's say, a month ago.
So, from your perspective and your experience, is there reason to be hopeful, to be optimistic about a potential deal coming to fruition?
Yes, well, it's a mixed bag because there are two schools of thought here in the Israeli public and among the families of the hostages. And one school of thought is you get as many hostages out as you can to rescue them, and then in stages you try to get the rest. And the other school of thought is no, you have to get them all out together, or else the ones who remain, and that includes, for example, young men who are not, let's say, infirm, elderly, or female, that you are leaving them to a fate that nobody wants, which is to say maybe we'll never see them again. So there's a big argument going on over that. Second of all, I never like to use the word ceasefire because the whole idea here is a pause in the fighting in order to rescue these poor people. 100 of them are still there. Some are dead, some are alive. We don't know the exact numbers. Hamas won't give us the exact names and numbers. It's so awful. And yet, we also can't afford to have another October 7th, which is what not only Hamas, but Hezbollah, all of Iran's proxies, would be happy to perpetrate. And that goes for Palestinians in the West Bank. So, we're in this terrible dilemma situation. And I'm really hoping, I am optimistic that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not going to do something that endangers, let's say, is going to do as much as he can to endanger as few people as he can.
Ruthie, so much is happening in the Middle East. We haven't even touched upon Syria just yet as they continue to try and rebuild some sort of government after President Assad, his regime toppled and he then fled to Russia. What are the other events and developing stories that you're keeping a very close eye on?
Well, the rebels led by al-Julani, the trouble is they're disparate rebels. They're not a unified group. They all were united in their hatred of Bashar Assad because he's still alive, a brutal dictator, slaughtered his own people, so did his father, used chemical weapons against them, tortured them, imprisoned them. We're seeing now the opening of these prisons where people were held in appalling conditions and also killed for the smallest so-called offenses. They're right to have wanted to topple him, and that's a very, very good development. However, these rebels, al-Julani is really a radical terrorist. He's a jihadist. And despite the fact that he's sort of dressing differently and trying to tell the West that he has changed, because actually the Biden administration just removed the $10 million bounty on his head, which was really his aim. I think that we cannot trust him one bit. Meanwhile, there's Turkey in Syria trying to reestablish itself, trying to kill off Kurds, trying to reestablish itself as some kind of Ottoman empire. Erdogan would like to be the emperor. There's a lot of really bad stuff going on there, and the story isn't over. I would just like to add one more thing, and that is a few days ago, a tunnel between Syria and Lebanon, on the border between them, a huge 10-kilometer tunnel that fits huge trucks through it that can drive through it. 10 kilometers, I think, is about 7 or 8 miles. You do the math. And a huge tunnel through which weapons from Iran were going through Syria into Lebanon. And it was lucky that that tunnel was discovered because, you see, part of the reason that Israel has to be very vigilant about Syria is that Syria was the place through which Iran transferred its weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Ruthie, before we let you go, is there anything else that you would like to share with our viewers this morning?
Yes, I'd like to say that, a missile hit, among other things, this week with the Houthis and the missiles that they fired, and one that was intercepted demolished the top floor of a building, by the way, and another that demolished a school in central Israel that now the kids have to find another building and all that. But the one on Friday night, just so you should get an idea, that one hit a playground. There's a huge crater there in a playground next to swings. Now, it's just by miracle that nobody was killed, okay? But what you also have to understand is it's not just whether people are physically injured or killed. The entire center of the country had to rush at 4:30 in the morning into shelters. You're woken up from a deep sleep. You have to run to shelters. Children are terrified. You never know, and we make jokes. It's gotten to the point where we make black jokes over it. We say, well, so what are bedtime? Do we have to wear our shoes to bed tonight so we can run into the bomb shelter? Also, many of those injured in that attack were injured running to bomb shelters and falling, that tripping and falling. I think this is the kind of thing you don't realize the effect, the ripple effect it has, even on people who are not directly hit or killed or seriously.
Ruthie, oh, there we go. We lost you just for a little bit, but we have you now. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us here on Live Now from Fox.
And thank you again, Stephanie, for having me.
Hey, everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Ready for a seriously wild ride today. We're going to be diving deep into some crazy stuff happening in the Middle East right now. The U.S., Israel, Yemen, the whole shebang.
Oh, yeah.
And especially those Houthi rebels everyone's talking about. You actually sent us this really interesting YouTube video from FOX News as a jumping off point. It's called U.S. Navy Pilots Shot Down Over Red Sea.
Wow.
That's intense, race. And get this, we're also going to be looking into a secret tunnel discovered between Syria and Lebanon.
No way.
Oh, yeah. And to top it all off, a playground got hit by a missile.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. So we've got our expert here to help us connect
Yeah.
all the dots. They know everything about this region. What do you say, ready to jump in?
I am. Let's do it.
All right, so let's start with that Red Sea thing. U.S. Navy pilots shot down, sounds like straight out of Top Gun, but luckily they were rescued alive.
Yeah, real dramatic stuff. From what we know, it happened when the U.S. was doing airstrikes on those Houthi rebels in Yemen. But the U.S. military hasn't really said much about the actual mission. The crazy part.
What's that?
Seems like it was a friendly fire incident, which just makes everything even more complicated.
Friendly fire. Yikes.
Yeah.
That just adds another layer of confusion to all this.
Yeah.
What does that even tell us about what's happening on the ground over there?
Well, it just shows you how risky and unpredictable military stuff can be, especially in a place that's already so tense. Even with the best tech and super trained people, these tragic mistakes can still happen, fog of war and all that.
Yeah, that's true. It makes you think about how good the communication and coordination is between all the different forces operating over there.
Sure.
But this whole thing is definitely tied to bigger issues, right? Like those rocket attacks that have been happening.
Oh, absolutely. That source you sent mentioned a rocket fired from Yemen that hit somewhere in Tel Aviv.
Oh, what?
16 people were injured. And the Israeli military thinks it was the Houthis. Now, here's the kicker. Houthi media is actually claiming they fired a hypersonic ballistic missile at some military target.
Hold on, a hypersonic ballistic missile. What even is that?
So hypersonic missiles, they travel 5 times faster than sound, at least. And they can dodge and weave,
Bro.
making them super hard to shoot down with the usual defense systems. If this is true, it definitely raises the stakes for everybody involved.
No kidding, that's scary stuff. And it sounds like the Israelis are taking it seriously, even admitting their defenses aren't foolproof.
Yeah, they're looking into the attack, and there are reports of Israeli airstrikes hitting Yemen's capital right after.
So it's like a back and forth, each side escalating. That's never good.
Yeah, definitely a worrying sign.
And the U.S. is involved too, right? Doing their own airstrikes against Houthi spots in Yemen.
Yep, they've been backing the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen for years now, although some people aren't happy about it. It's like a giant knot of alliances and rivalries, everyone looking out for themselves in this crazy, unstable place.
So we've got the U.S., Israel, Yemen, and the Houthis all tangled up in this mess. Where does Iran fit into all this? They always seem to be involved somehow.
Iran is the key piece of this puzzle. They may not be directly involved in these specific events, but they've been supporting the Houthis for years. Some experts think the Houthis are basically Iran's puppets, a way for them to throw their weight around without directly fighting Israel or Saudi Arabia.
So it's like Iran's playing chess, using the Houthis as their pieces.
Exactly. It's what we call a proxy conflict. Powerful countries using other groups to fight their battles. And it makes things in the Middle East even crazier because now it's not just the countries there, it's global powers using these proxy wars to get what they want.
Man, that's kind of unsettling, like a secret war happening all over the world.
Yeah.
And speaking of global players, that article mentioned Trump may be coming back to the White House. Could that change things in the Middle East?
Yeah. Well, it's wild how even just the thought of Trump coming back is already having an effect. He's not president yet, but just him being out there is changing how the world sees things, and it might be making groups like the Houthis bolder,
So just the idea of him is enough to shake things up.
Exactly. It's all about perception and what people expect. And this source is saying Trump's whole style with the Middle East was totally different from Biden's.
How so?
While Biden's more into diplomacy and being cautious, while Trump was all about being tough, getting quick wins, and showing everyone how strong America is. It really makes you wonder what would happen if he came back.
That's like everyone's holding their breath, waiting to see what happens next. But hey, at least there's some good news, right? There are ceasefire talks happening between Israel and Hamas. Maybe there's some hope for peace in there somewhere.
There is, but it's a fragile hope. The article points out a big problem in the talks, the hostages. It seems like people in Israel are really divided on how to handle this whole situation, and it's really sensitive.
I can imagine. Wanting your people back, but not wanting to give in to demands and make groups like Hamas stronger. What a tough spot.
It's a terrible situation, and it really shows how much this conflict is affecting real people. The source describes how scared and uncertain everyone feels, especially the kids. Imagine having to run to bomb shelters in the middle of the night, not knowing if you'll be safe.
It's just awful.
Yeah,
It's easy to forget about the human side of things when we're talking about politics and military strategy.
it is. And the damage this conflict does to people's minds, the trauma, the constant fear, that can't be ignored.
This is heavy stuff. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
We have, and there's still a lot to talk about.
Okay, deep breath. Ready to move on?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, let's talk about Syria. I mean, it feels like it's always in crisis mode, but the source mentioned some especially worrying stuff happening there too.
Good point. Syria adds a whole other level of crazy to this situation. It's been trying to rebuild a government since President Assad was overthrown, and things are really messy on the ground.
Messy. What do you mean by that?
It means there's no one really in charge. There are all these different rebel groups fighting for power, each with their own ideas and goals.
Gotcha.
And that makes it almost impossible to get any kind of peace or stability.
Right, right. And the source mentioned this guy, Al-Jilani, who leads one of these rebel groups. Apparently, Biden took away the reward for capturing him, which seems kind of risky since no one really knows what his deal is.
Yeah, he's a controversial figure. Some think he's important in the fight against extremists, while others see him as a dangerous guy who could use the chaos to his advantage. It's a gamble. We'll see how it plays out.
And then there's that massive tunnel they found between Syria and Lebanon. It was being used to move weapons from Iran, which can't be
Yeah,
good.
not at all. That tunnel is a real sign of how much power Iran has in the region, and it plays into Israel's worst fears, that Syria is becoming a pipeline for Iranian weapons that could be used against them.
Feels like we're sitting on a powder keg, just waiting for someone to light the fuse. This whole Iran thing, it's not just about Israel, though, right?
No, it affects the whole region. Saudi Arabia, they're Sunni Muslim and close to the U.S., and they see Iran as a huge threat, too. They're basically in a proxy war with Iran, fighting for control in places like Yemen and Iraq.
It's like this giant chess game with everyone making moves trying to outsmart each other.
Exactly. And then you've got the U.S. and Russia involved, too, making things even more complicated. The U.S. has always supported Israel and Saudi Arabia, while Russia has been backing Assad in Syria. It's a mess of alliances and rivalries that makes finding a real solution almost impossible.
Man, it's hard to see a way out of this. But let's go back to that source you've been working with. What does it say about what could happen with all this tension building up?
The source really highlights the human cost of all this fighting. It paints a really sad picture of the suffering and displacement of innocent people who are caught in the middle.
Yeah.
Remember that playground hit by a missile? It's a scary reminder that even kids aren't safe from war.
It's heartbreaking. Kids should be worried about playing, not bombs and rockets.
Exactly. And the damage it does to whole communities, the trauma of living with constant danger, the fear that's everywhere that can't be overstated. It affects people for generations.
It's easy to get caught up in the big picture and forget about the real people who are suffering.
It is. And that's why it's so important to remember their stories, their experiences, when we're trying to understand this conflict. This isn't just about politics. It's about millions of real people whose lives are being turned upside down.
You're right. And we can't forget about those hostages. That seems to be a major roadblock in the ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas. What does the source say about that?
It talks about the really tough decision Israel has to make. Do they rescue their people, or do they risk making Hamas stronger and maybe even facing more attacks in the future? People in Israel are really divided on what to do. It's a moral struggle that's weighing on everyone.
I can only imagine the pressure on the Israeli government to make the right choice. But what even is the right choice in this situation? It feels like there's no good outcome.
It's a horrible choice to have to make, and there are no easy answers. No matter what they decide, there will be people who disagree, and there will be consequences. Some people will say they should be tough, refuse to talk to terrorists, and maybe even let the hostages die to prevent more attacks in the future. Others will say they should focus on saving their people, even if it means giving Hamas what they want.
I wonder, what do you think is the best way to handle situations like this? Is there a way to get the hostages back safely without putting the country at risk?
That's a question that's been bothering leaders and military experts for a long time. There's no single right answer. It usually depends on the specific situation, who the hostage takers are, and the political climate. But I think the most important thing is to make sure the hostages are safe, while also working to get rid of the things that allow these groups to exist in the first place.
So it's about finding a balance between doing something right now to save lives and figuring out long-term solutions to prevent this from happening again.
Exactly. We have to be able to react to crises and deal with them effectively, but we also have to work on preventing them from happening in the first place.
It's like walking a tightrope. But it seems like everything we talk about comes back to this idea that the Middle East is facing a bunch of interconnected problems, each one making the others worse. It's like a tangled mess with no way out.
That's a good way to put it. And sadly, this isn't anything new. The Middle East has been a place of conflict and instability for centuries because of historical grudges, religious and ethnic divisions, and the constant fight for power and resources.
So where do we go from here? Is there any hope for a better future in this region?
I think there's always hope. But we have to change how we think about things. We have to move away from this idea that one side can only win if the other side loses.
What do you mean by that?
I mean this idea that someone has to lose for someone else to win. This kind of thinking has been fueling violence and revenge for generations. It's the belief that you can only be safe if someone else is unsafe, that peace can only come through domination and control.
So if that's the problem, what's the solution? How do we get past this destructive way of thinking?
It takes building trust, talking to each other, and finding solutions that work for everyone involved. It means recognizing that the people on the other side are human beings too, and that their safety and well-being are connected to our own.
That sounds good in theory, but incredibly tough to do in reality, especially with all the anger and mistrust between these groups.
It's definitely difficult. But history shows us that even the worst enemies can find common ground when they realize that fighting hurts everyone more than it helps.
Okay, so let's talk about what we can actually do. What needs to happen to make this idea of a peaceful Middle East a reality? What are the key things we need for a lasting solution?
There are no quick fixes, but I think there are a few really important things. First, we need strong and effective leaders, both within the Middle East and from the rest of the world. Leaders who are dedicated to peace, who aren't afraid to make tough decisions, and who are willing to challenge the way things are.
So it's about more than just talking and negotiating. It's about having the will and the vision to create a different kind of future.
Exactly. We need leaders who can inspire hope, who can help people reconcile, and who put the well-being of all people first, no matter their ethnicity, religion, or political beliefs.
It sounds like the kind of leadership that's hard to find these days.
Maybe, but it's the kind of leadership we desperately need if we want to stop these cycles of violence and build a future where everyone can thrive.
So strong leadership is one piece of the puzzle. What else do we need?
We also need to address the social and economic problems that often lead to conflict. This means investing in education, healthcare, and creating jobs, especially in communities that have been marginalized. It's about giving people opportunities to succeed, to build better lives for themselves and their families, and to feel like they are a part of society.
So it's not just about stopping the fighting. It's about building a fairer and more just society where everyone has a chance to do well.
Exactly. Real peace means more than just the absence of violence. It means creating a world where everyone feels safe, secure, respected, and like they have a chance to succeed.
That makes a lot of sense. When people feel hopeless and like they don't matter, they're more likely to turn to extremism and violence. So how do we address these inequalities?
It takes a combined effort from governments, international organizations, and everyday people. We need to invest in infrastructure, support businesses, and make sure everyone has access to quality education and healthcare. It's about giving people the power to control their own lives and build a better future for their communities.
That sounds like a huge undertaking.
It is, but it's not impossible. There are so many people and organizations out there working hard to tackle these problems, to bring people together, and to create a world that is fairer and more just. And it's our responsibility to support them, to help them be heard, and to do our part in building a more peaceful and prosperous future.
This has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much, not just about what's happening right now, but about the history and the social forces that are shaping this region. It's complicated and challenging, but it's so important to understand.
I agree. And I hope this conversation has inspired you to keep learning about these issues, to have thoughtful discussions with others, and to think about how you can help create a more peaceful and just world. Al-Jilani, he's like a symptom of all the chaos in Syria.
Yeah.
He became powerful as the head of this group, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham,
Right.
one of the biggest rebel groups fighting against Assad. They've been accused of some pretty bad stuff, human rights abuses, and they have links to extremist ideas. That's why the U.S. was after him in the first place.
So why would Biden lift the bounty on his head? Seems risky considering his past.
It is. It's definitely a calculated risk. There are a couple of ways to look at it. Some people think al-Jilani's mellowed out a bit, that he could actually help fight against ISIS and other extremists. Others think it's just a desperate move, trying to find anyone who can stand up to Assad and bring some stability back to the region.
Sounds like a big gamble with a lot riding on it.
Exactly. And this decision has gotten a lot of pushback, especially from Israel. They see al-Jilani and his group as a direct threat.
Right. Israel's always been super sensitive about anything happening on their northern border with Syria. They've had a lot of clashes with groups operating in that area.
Oh, for sure. And they've made it clear they won't tolerate any Iranian presence in Syria. They've launched tons of airstrikes to stop it.
Makes sense.
And that tunnel we talked about, the one smuggling weapons from Iran through Syria to Lebanon, that's exactly what Israel's worried about. They see it as proof that Iran is actively arming Hezbollah, that powerful Shiite group in Lebanon, basically creating a whole network of threats right next door.
It's like a ticking time bomb just waiting to explode. But this tension with Iran, it's not just Israel, is it?
No, it's a problem for the whole region. Saudi Arabia, they're mostly Sunni Muslim, and they're tight with the U.S. They see Iran as a huge threat, too. They're locked in this kind of shadow war with Iran, fighting for influence in places like Yemen and Iraq.
So it's like this giant chessboard,
Yeah.
right? With all these different players making moves, trying to outmaneuver each other.
That's a great way to put it. And then you've got the U.S. and Russia involved, too, which makes everything even more complicated. The U.S. has always been on Israel and Saudi Arabia's side, while Russia's been backing Assad in Syria. It's this tangled web of alliances and rivalries, and finding a way out of it is next to impossible.
Man, it's tough to see a clear path forward with all this going on. But let's go back to the source material for a second. What does it say about the possible consequences of all this tension?
The source really hits hard on the human cost of this conflict. It paints this really vivid picture of the suffering and displacement of innocent people who are caught in the crossfire. Like, remember that playground we talked about? The one that got hit by a missile?
Yeah, it's awful.
It's a chilling reminder that even kids aren't safe from the horrors of war.
It's truly heartbreaking. Those kids should be worrying about swings and slides, not bombs and rockets.
Absolutely. And the psychological impact on whole communities, the trauma of living under constant threat, the fear that permeates every aspect of daily life, it's immense. It has consequences that last for generations.
It's so easy to get caught up in all the political and military stuff and forget about the human impact.
It is. And that's why it's crucial to center those stories, those individual experiences in our understanding of what's happening. This isn't just some abstract political issue. It has real-world consequences for millions of people.
You're right. And we can't forget about the hostage situation. It seems like that's a major sticking point in the ceasefire negotiations between Israel and Hamas. What does the source say about that?
It really highlights the horrible dilemma Israel faces, rescue their citizens or potentially make Hamas stronger and risk even more attacks. It talks about how divided Israeli society is on how to handle this, a real moral struggle that everyone's grappling with.
I can only imagine the pressure the Israeli government is under to make the right decision. But what even is the right decision in a situation like this? It feels like a no-win situation.
It's a tragic choice with no easy answers. And no matter what decision they make, there will be people who criticize it, and there will be consequences. Some will say they need to take a hard line, refuse to negotiate with terrorists, and maybe even accept the loss of the hostages to prevent future attacks. Others will say that saving their citizens should be the priority, even if it means making concessions to Hamas.
I wonder, what do you think is the most effective approach in situations like this? Is there a way to guarantee the hostages' safety without compromising national security?
That's a question that has plagued policymakers and military strategists for decades. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. It really depends on the specific circumstances, who the hostage takers are, and the overall political climate. But in my opinion, the most important thing is to prioritize the safety of the hostages above everything else, while at the same time working to dismantle the structures that allow these groups to thrive.
So it's about finding a balance between taking immediate action to save lives and developing long-term strategies to address the root causes of these conflicts.
Exactly. We need to be both reactive and proactive. We need to respond to crises effectively while also working to create conditions where these crises are less likely to occur in the first place.
It sounds like a delicate balancing act, but it feels like we keep coming back to this idea that the Middle East is facing a whole bunch of interconnected challenges, each one feeding into the other. It's like this tangled web with no easy way out.
You're absolutely right. And unfortunately, this isn't a new phenomenon. The Middle East has been a region of conflict and instability for centuries, shaped by historical grievances, religious and ethnic divisions, and the constant struggle for power and resources.
So where do we go from here? Is there any hope for a brighter future in this region?
I believe there's always hope, but it requires a fundamental shift in perspective, a willingness to move beyond what we call the zero-sum mentality that has often characterized these conflicts.
What do you mean by zero-sum mentality?
It's this idea that one side can only win if the other side loses. This kind of thinking has fueled cycles of violence and retribution for generations. It's a belief that security can only be achieved at the expense of another group's security, that peace is only possible through domination and control.
So if that's the problem, what's the solution? How do we move beyond this destructive way of thinking?
It takes building trust, fostering dialogue, and finding solutions that address the needs and concerns of all parties involved. It means recognizing the shared humanity of those on the other side and understanding that their security and well-being are intertwined with our own.
It sounds idealistic, but also incredibly challenging, especially given the deep-seated animosity and mistrust that exists between some of these groups.
It's undoubtedly difficult, but history has shown time and again that even the most bitter enemies can find common ground when there's a shared recognition that the costs of conflict far outweigh any potential gains.
Okay, so let's talk about concrete steps. What needs to happen to make this vision of a more peaceful Middle East a reality? What are the essential elements for a lasting solution?
There are no quick fixes, but I believe there are several crucial elements. First, we need strong and effective leadership, both within the region and from the international community. Leaders who are committed to peace, who have the courage to make tough decisions, and who are willing to challenge the status quo.
So it's about more than just diplomacy and negotiations. It's about the will and the vision to create a different kind of future.
Exactly. It's about leadership that inspires hope, that fosters reconciliation, and that prioritizes the well-being of all people, regardless of their ethnicity, religion, or political affiliation.
It sounds like the kind of leadership that's in short supply these days.
Perhaps. But it's the kind of leadership we desperately need if we want to break these cycles of violence and build a more sustainable future.
So leadership is one key ingredient. What else is needed?
We also need to address the underlying social and economic inequalities that often fuel conflict. This means investing in education, healthcare, and job creation, particularly in marginalized communities. It's about creating opportunities for people to thrive, to build a better life for themselves and their families, and to feel like they have a stake in their society.
So it's not just about ending the fighting, but about creating a more just and equitable society where everyone has a chance to succeed.
Precisely. Sustainable peace requires not only the absence of violence, but also the presence of justice, opportunity, and a sense of shared purpose.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
If people feel hopeless and disenfranchised, they're more likely to be drawn to extremism and violence. So what can be done to address these inequalities?
It requires a concerted effort from governments, international organizations, and civil society. It requires investing in infrastructure, promoting entrepreneurship, and providing access to quality education and healthcare. It's about empowering people to take control of their own lives and to build a better future for their communities.
It sounds like a monumental task.
It is. But it's not impossible. There are countless individuals and organizations working tirelessly to address these challenges, to build bridges, and to create a more just and equitable world. And it's our responsibility to support those efforts, to amplify those voices, and to contribute to the creation of a more peaceful and prosperous future.
This has been an incredible deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much, not just about the current events, but about the deeper historical and social forces that are shaping this region. It's complex, it's challenging, but it's also incredibly important to understand.
I agree. And I hope this conversation has inspired you to continue exploring these issues, to engage in thoughtful conversations, and to consider how you can contribute to a more peaceful and just world.
It's a lot to process for sure, but you're right, there are people out there making a difference.
Yeah, and even just staying informed, having these conversations, it all helps. Awareness is the first step to taking action.
Absolutely. And what's been so helpful in this deep dive is how you've connected all these different pieces. We started with U.S. Navy pilots getting shot down over the Red Sea, and somehow we're talking about Syria, Iran, and the whole Israel-Palestine situation. It's crazy how it all ties together.
It really is. Everything's connected in the Middle East. What happens in one place affects everything else. That's why understanding the history, the politics, and what's driving everyone involved is so important.
And we can't forget the human side of it all. Those kids hiding in bomb shelters, families torn apart by the fighting. It's easy to get lost in the big picture stuff, but it's real people who are suffering the most.
Exactly. And that's why I think any real solution has to start with human rights and dignity for everyone. Peace isn't just about stopping the fighting. It's about creating a world where everyone feels safe, respected, and like they belong.
I love that. It's a good reminder that peace isn't just some political goal. It's something we all need as humans. But achieving that in a place like the Middle East, it seems almost impossible. What makes you think it could actually happen?
What gives me hope is how resilient people are. Even with all the suffering they face, people in the Middle East keep working for peace, building connections, and imagining a better future. I've seen firsthand the courage of activists, the dedication of aid workers, and the hope that ordinary people hold on to, that dream of a more peaceful world. They just refuse to give up.
That's really powerful. It reminds me that even in the midst of all the bad stuff, there are these glimmers of hope, these little sparks of resistance against how things are.
Exactly. And those sparks are what we need to focus on to help them grow and spread. They're the seeds of a better future, just waiting to be planted and nurtured.
Well said. We've covered a lot today. We've dug into the complexities of the Middle East, looked at the problems and possible solutions, and most importantly, remembered the human cost of it all.
It's been a great conversation. I hope it's inspired everyone listening to keep learning about these issues, to have thoughtful discussions with others, and to think about how they can contribute to making the world a more peaceful and just place.
I hope so too. And with that, a huge thank you to you, our expert, for sharing your knowledge and insights with us today. And to you, our listener, thank you for sending us your source and for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.